I wasn't supposed to be in that meeting. I only walked in because I forgot my notebook on the table from earlier. But the second I opened the door, I froze. My boss, Mr. Hayes, was standing way too close to one of the new interns, whispering something in her ear that made her giggle. His hand resting right on her waist. This was the same man who'd spent the morning bragging about his 20-year marriage during the team huddle. The same guy who had a framed photo of his wife and kids sitting right on his desk. You ever walk into a scene that just shifts the air? Like, you know you shouldn't be there, but you also know something's about to go down? That was me, standing there, frozen, pretending I didn't see what I saw. He jerked his hand back the second he noticed me. "Oh, Madison," he said, clearing his throat. "We were just discussing her performance review." The intern, a nervous little thing named Brittany, gave a quick nod, eyes darting to the floor. "Right," I said, keeping my voice steady even though my stomach was turning. Didn't mean to interrupt. I grabbed my notebook and walked out, but my heart was pounding. I'd seen office politics, sure, but this was something darker. If you're new here, stay tuned, because this story, it's about power, revenge, and the one mistake that changed everything. I'm telling it because women get blamed way too often for staying silent when men like him cross the line. And if you've ever been underestimated, used, or made to feel small, yeah, this one's for you. Anyway, this all happened in Dallas, Texas, at a mid-sized marketing firm that looked picture-perfect on the outside, but was rotting from the inside out. The next day, he called me into his office. "Close the door," he said, leaning back in his chair like he owned the world. I did. And that's when he smiled, that kind of smile that doesn't reach the eyes. "You saw something yesterday, didn't you?" he said, pretending to sound casual. I hesitated. "Not really. I didn't see much." He smirked. "Good, because Brittany's just going through a lot. I'm mentoring her. You understand, right? Mentoring. Right. That's what he was calling it. Something about the way he said it made my skin crawl. But I wasn't stupid. I'd seen enough women get labeled as difficult or unprofessional just for speaking up. So I nodded. "Of course. Good girl," he said. And I swear to God that phrase lit a fire in me. After that, things got weird. He started hovering near my desk. Little comments like, "You've got a good head on your shoulders, Madison," or "You should dress more confidently. You'd look great in red." Every woman in the office knew that look. The one where he lingered too long, his smile just a bit too friendly. But nobody said anything. Because he was the boss. Because he could make or break your career. And me? I needed this job. Rent wasn't gonna pay itself. Still, I started watching him. Not because I wanted to, but because I had a gut feeling he was trouble. And I was right. 2 weeks later, I caught him and Brittany sneaking into his car after hours. She looked nervous, glancing over her shoulder. He looked like a man who'd never been told no. I stayed in the shadows of the parking lot, phone in hand, recording just enough to know what was going on. Not because I planned to use it. Not yet. But something inside me said, this won't end well. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about his wife. I'd seen her once. She came by the office with their kids, dropping off cupcakes for his birthday. Sweet, warm, polite. The kind of woman who smiled at everyone, even the interns. And I thought, does she have any idea who she's married to? I guess that's when it started. That pull inside me that said, he picked the wrong woman to mess with, because I wasn't just some random employee he could manipulate. I'd been underestimated before, and I'd learned how to fight back. Quietly, strategically. But here's the thing about power. People like him think they'll never lose it. And that's exactly what makes them sloppy. Over the next few weeks, I watched, listened, waited. And when he made his next move, on me, I knew exactly what I was going to do. A week after that night in the parking lot, things between me and Mr. Hayes started to feel different. The way he looked at me changed. Before, it was just that typical boss charm, fake smiles and polite compliments. But now, his eyes lingered longer, like he was testing boundaries, waiting to see if I'd flinch. And I didn't. Not because I wanted him anywhere near me, but because I'd already made up my mind to play his game until I figured out what kind of man he really was. It started small. He'd stop by my desk more often. always with some fake excuse. Need help with the Johnson account? Or want to grab lunch to discuss your goals here? But the conversations had nothing to do with work. They were filled with personal questions about my love life, my weekends, what I did for fun. Every answer I gave, he analyzed, like he was profiling me. I could feel him testing how far he could go. And when he finally crossed that line, it wasn't even subtle. It was a Thursday. Everyone had left for the day except me. I stayed late to finish a client pitch deck. The office was quiet, just the hum of the AC and the glow from the computer screens. I didn't even hear him walk up behind me until he spoke. "You're dedicated," he said softly, his voice right next to my ear. I flinched and spun around. He was too close, leaning over my chair, his cologne thick in the air. "Just trying to get this done," I said, forcing a polite smile. "I don't like leaving things unfinished." He smiled back, slow and deliberate. "I like that about you. You're not like the others." His hand rested on the edge of my desk, his body still blocking my way out. My heart started to race, part fear, part anger. "Sir, I really should—" He cut me off. "Relax, Madison. I'm just saying. You're impressive, smart, beautiful, focused." He paused like he wanted the silence to stretch. "I could help you move up here, you know. There are positions opening soon, and I have a lot of say in those decisions." There it was, the trap disguised as a compliment. My throat went dry. I could have told him off right there, but I knew that would only make things worse. For me, not for him. So I swallowed hard and said, "That's kind of you to say, but I'm fine where I am." He chuckled like he'd expected that answer, like he thought it was cute. "You remind me of my wife when we first met, so independent. But eventually, she learned that letting someone take care of you isn't weakness." That line made me sick to my stomach. I managed a tight smile and stood up, pretending to gather my things. "I really should head home," I said. He nodded, but his eyes said something else entirely. Something that made me feel like I needed a shower. "Of course. Just think about what I said," he murmured. I left before he could say another word. That night, I sat in my apartment, replaying it all in my head. My roommate, Janelle, walked in halfway through my mental meltdown. "You look like you just saw a ghost," she said, tossing her purse on the couch. I told her everything. She listened quietly, her expression going from disbelief to fury. "You need to report him," she said. "That's harassment." I sighed. "And get fired? He runs the whole department, Janelle. HR practically worships him. You think they'd take my word over his?" She didn't have an answer for that. None of us ever do. We've seen this story too many times. The man gets a slap on the wrist. The woman gets labeled problematic. But still, I couldn't let it go. Something about the smug way he looked at me, like he'd already decided I was his next target, lit a fuse in me. I wasn't sure what I was going to do yet, but I knew I couldn't let him win. Over the next few days, I started noticing things. Brittany, the intern, had stopped smiling. She used to giggle at everything. Now she avoided eye contact, kept her head down. Her work had slipped too. I caught her crying in the bathroom once, and when she saw me, she froze like a deer in headlights. I didn't say anything, but I knew. I knew exactly what was happening. Then came Friday. Mr. Hayes called me into his office again. "Close the door," he said, same as before. My pulse spiked, but I did it. He gestured for me to sit. "Listen," he said, folding his hands like we were about to have some serious professional talk. "You're one of my best employees, Madison. I see potential in you. Real leadership material." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. "And I want to mentor you," he continued. "Help you grow here. But mentorship takes connection, trust." He leaned forward. "Sometimes it even means meeting outside of work hours. Dinner, drinks, that sort of thing." There it was again, that fake offer of opportunity that was really just a test. I forced myself to smile. "I appreciate that," I said carefully, "but I like keeping work and personal life separate." He raised an eyebrow, almost amused. "You're ambitious, aren't you? That's good. But don't be naive. Relationships are what make people successful." "You scratch my back." He didn't finish the sentence. But he didn't have to. My blood boiled. I wanted to slap that smug grin off his face. But instead, I stood up. "Thank you for the offer," I said calmly, "but I think I'll figure things out on my own." He watched me go with a look that said he wasn't used to hearing no. And as I walked out of his office, I could feel it. The shift. I'd just made an enemy. But something else had shifted too. The moment I realized he'd chosen the wrong woman to try this with. I wasn't Brittany. I wasn't scared anymore. I was angry. Angry enough to do something about it. And in that moment, I decided, if he wanted to play dirty, I could play smarter. He thought this was just another game. He had no idea the kind of player I really was. After that meeting, everything at work changed. It wasn't obvious at first. No yelling, no threats. Just subtle shifts that anyone on the outside might have missed. My projects started getting reassigned. Emails I sent went unanswered. Suddenly, meetings I was supposed to be in were rescheduled without me. It was like being slowly erased from my own job. That's the thing about men like Mr. Hayes. They don't always come for you directly. They make you doubt yourself first. Make you question if you're overreacting. But I wasn't. I knew exactly what he was doing. The silence, the side comments, the smirks in the hallway. It all had one purpose: punishment. He was showing me what happens when a woman tells him no. I kept my head down, did my work, and smiled when I had to. But inside, I was boiling. Every time he walked past my desk and made a point not to look at me, I wanted to scream. I started documenting everything. Every email, every strange schedule change, every coincidental mistake that made me look bad. I kept it all in a hidden folder on my home laptop. Janelle said I was overthinking, but I told her, no, I know this pattern. He's trying to build a case, trying to make it look like I can't do my job. Then came the Friday review meeting. The whole team was there, and Mr. Hayes stood at the head of the table, his favorite power spot. "Let's talk about client satisfaction," he said, scanning the room. His eyes landed on me, and I knew I was next. "Madison," he said, smiling that same fake smile, "I've noticed some issues with your recent work, especially with the Thompson account." My stomach dropped. The Thompson account was perfect. I'd stayed late 3 nights to finish it. "I'm sorry, what issues?" I asked. He turned to the group. "She missed key deliverables and failed to communicate with the client." The room went quiet. "That's not true," I said, my voice steady but sharp. "I sent updates every day." "You were copied on the emails?" He gave a fake little laugh. "Well, I didn't receive them." Then he shrugged. "Maybe next time, double-check your recipients." Everyone avoided eye contact. He'd humiliated me publicly, and he knew it. When the meeting ended, I packed my notebook without saying a word. But as I stood up, he leaned close enough for only me to hear. "You could have made this a lot easier on yourself," he whispered. "You still can." My blood ran cold. That was the first moment I actually felt afraid. Not just angry, afraid. Because I realized he wasn't just some arrogant boss with a wandering eye. He was dangerous. The kind of man who didn't just ruin reputations. He destroyed people quietly. And he had power, connections, and money to make it all look clean. That night, I cried for the first time since it all started. Not because of him, but because I hated how powerless I felt. But crying only lasted an hour. After that, I opened my laptop and started researching. Workplace retaliation laws, sexual harassment cases in Texas, whistleblower protections. I read until 3 a.m. The next week he escalated. It started with small things. My keycard randomly stopped working one morning. It said it was a glitch. Then, my lunch went missing from the fridge. Twice. Childish, right? But that's how these people work. They start small to see if you'll flinch. One afternoon, Brittany brushed past me in the hallway, eyes red and swollen. I reached out. "Brittany, hey, are you okay?" She froze. I can't talk about it," she stammered and walked away. That's when I knew. Whatever he'd done to her, it was worse than I thought. That night, I called my older sister, Danny. She's a lawyer. Not corporate, but family law. Still, she knew enough to scare me. "Madison, document everything," she said. "Every conversation. Every weird email. Don't delete a thing." I told her I already was. "Good," she said. Because guys like that, they count on you getting tired, on you giving up before they do. That line stuck with me. I wrote it on a sticky note and stuck it on my bathroom mirror. Don't give up before he does. The next day I came into work early, earlier than anyone else. I sat at my desk and stared at his office door. The lights were off, blinds closed. On his desk, that framed picture of his wife and 2 kids stared back at me. They looked so normal, so happy. My chest tightened. Did his wife have any idea who she was married to? Probably not. But she would. Someday. Not yet, but soon. By lunchtime, I'd made up my mind. I wasn't going to run or quit. That's what he wanted. Instead, I was going to get him fired. Not just fired, exposed. But I couldn't do it alone. I needed proof. Real proof. That meant playing along just long enough for him to slip up again. It made my skin crawl just thinking about it, but I knew it was the only way. So when he stopped by my desk that afternoon, all smug and smiling, I looked up at him and smiled back. Just barely. "Hey, Madison," he said. "How's your day?" "Better now," I said softly. His eyebrows shot up, surprised. "Is that right?" "Maybe," I said. "I've been thinking about what you said the other day. About opportunities." He grinned. That slow, predatory grin that told me I'd just given him exactly what he wanted. "Glad to hear it. Maybe we can discuss it tonight. Over dinner?" I took a deep breath and nodded. "Sure. Dinner sounds nice." He had no idea that this dinner wasn't going to be what he thought. Because this wasn't about getting ahead. This was about getting even. And by the time it was over, I was going to make sure he understood exactly who he was dealing with. The night of the dinner, I could feel my pulse in my throat from the second I left my apartment. My hands shook so bad I almost dropped my keys twice before I even got to my car. I wasn't nervous about seeing him. I was nervous about holding myself together long enough to pull this off. The restaurant he picked was one of those sleek, dimly lit places downtown where the waiters wore all black and called everyone sir and ma'am. The kind of place meant to impress. When I got there, he was already sitting at a corner booth, nursing a glass of whiskey, looking way too comfortable for a married man on a fake business dinner. "You look incredible," he said when he saw me, his eyes scanning every inch of me like he had a right to. I smiled, just like I'd practiced in the mirror. "Thank you, Mr. Hayes." "Oh, come on," he said, waving his hand. "You can call me David." I sat down and forced a laugh. "All right, David." He launched into small talk, pretending this was all professional, asking about my family, my future goals, my ambitions. But there was something in his tone, a slick, heavy thing under the surface. I let him talk, smiling, nodding, pretending to listen while I quietly hit record on my phone. It sat in my lap, face down, capturing everything. Halfway through dinner, he leaned closer, his voice dropping low. "You know," he said, "you and I could do great things together. I see potential in you, Madison. You've got drive. You've got that spark." I took a sip of water. "And what would that partnership look like?" He smirked. "Let's just say we help each other out. You keep me happy, I make sure you move up." I wanted to throw the glass in his face, but I didn't. Instead, I smiled like it was exactly what I wanted to hear. "I appreciate that," I said softly. "I've been thinking a lot about what I really want in this job." He grinned, clearly convinced he'd won. That's what I like to hear. When the bill came, he covered it with a dramatic flourish, like he was doing me some kind of favor. Then, outside in the parking lot, he got bold. He reached for my arm, his thumb brushing my wrist. "I can tell we're going to have a good thing, you and me." I took a step back, feigning shyness. "Maybe. I'll think about it." Then I walked away, my heart pounding like thunder. I sat in my car for 10 minutes after that, shaking, staring at my reflection in the rearview mirror. I didn't recognize myself, but I also didn't feel weak anymore. I felt angry, focused. The recording was clear. Every slimy word, every implication. Perfect. Still, a voice in my head whispered, "This isn't enough. Not yet. You need something bigger. Something that will bury him." A few days later, that something walked right into my life. It was Monday morning, and HR sent an email announcing a new charity event the firm was sponsoring. "Family Night Out," it said in the subject line. "All employees and families invited. My heart dropped when I saw the RSVP list. David Hayes, and guest Melissa Hayes, his wife. I didn't know what I expected, but when she walked into the office later that week, it felt like the air shifted. Melissa Hayes wasn't at all what I pictured. She was beautiful, yes, but not in that perfectly polished corporate wife kind of way. She had warmth, grace. She smiled when she met people. And when she reached my desk and said, "Hi, you must be Madison. I've heard so much about you." I nearly forgot how to breathe. She was kind, genuine, the total opposite of him. And something about her felt familiar. Her voice, maybe, or the way she looked at me with that soft, patient curiosity. "You went to Baylor, right?" she asked. I blinked. "Yeah." "You too?" "Class of 2012, she said with a grin. My mouth fell open. "Wait, Melissa Carter?" Her eyes lit up. "Oh my God, Madison Young? From freshman dorms?" I laughed, stunned. "No way." She reached over and hugged me like we were old friends, which, technically, we were. We'd shared a dorm floor our first year of college, before she dropped out to move back home for a bit. I'd lost touch with her completely after that. And now, years later, she was standing in front of me, married to the man trying to destroy my career. My stomach twisted as she chatted about her kids, her charity work, how proud she was of David. Every word was a knife, because now it wasn't just some faceless wife I was defending. It was someone I actually knew, someone who used to sit on my dorm room floor eating ramen and talking about wanting a simple, honest life. When she said, "David's been working so hard lately, I barely see him," I nearly broke. I forced a smile. "Yeah, he's really dedicated." That night, I couldn't sleep. I stared at the ceiling, listening to cars pass outside my window, thinking about how small the world could be. Out of every woman in Dallas, he had to marry someone I knew, and out of every employee, he had to choose me to manipulate. I thought about telling her right then, about sending the recordings, the screenshots, everything. But something told me to wait. Not yet. If I was going to do this, I needed to do it right. Over the next few days, I started piecing together a new plan. The charity event was coming up in 2 weeks, and Melissa would be there. So would the rest of the company. It would be the perfect stage, but I needed more proof, something no one could deny, not even HR. So I decided to give David exactly what he wanted, a chance to trust me again, a chance to get comfortable. And when he did, when he thought he had me wrapped around his finger, that's when I'd strike. I looked at myself in the mirror that night and whispered, "You picked the wrong girl, David." And I meant every word. I began by pretending to be exactly what he wanted. Compliant, flattering, grateful for mentorship, someone easily impressed by his supposed wisdom. I smiled when he praised me, laughed when he made a joke at my expense, and nodded when he suggested steps that would accelerate my career. All while my mind moved in a different direction, calculating, cataloging, and preparing. Every compliment he paid became a breadcrumb I could use later. Every offhand admission was a timestamp I logged in my head. I volunteered for extra projects that would place me in the same rooms as him and Brittany at odd hours. I accidentally stayed late to grab a file, which gave me plausible reasons to be where I needed to be when he slipped up. I accepted his dinner invitations with a soft, rehearsed reluctance that made him feel victorious. He mistook my patience for availability, and that arrogance slowed the man down. I created a routine. Show willingness, gather proof, retreat. The first week I focused on communications, saving emails, screen capturing messages, recording conversations where legal. I learned where he left his phone on speaker. I memorized digital fingerprints like a detective memorizes faces. The second week I widened the net. Hotel receipts, calendar entries, booking confirmations that didn't quite line up with client meetings, photos he thought were private because they were sent via direct message. I kept duplicates, one copy encrypted and stashed in cloud storage behind layers of passwords only I could remember, another burned to a flash drive, and a third hidden inside a folder that looked like grocery lists and expense reports. I labeled everything methodically, so when the moment came, I wouldn't fumble with scattered files or shaky narratives. Meanwhile, I cultivated cover. I joked in Slack, posted harmless photos at odd hours to build the story that I was too social to be righteous, too young to be vindictive. I fed rumors that made my interest in office advancement seem genuine. So when anyone asked why I'd sat through late dinners with the boss, HR could not easily paint me as vengeful. I cultivated allies in the mailroom, the front desk, and on the IT team. People who noticed who came and went and could corroborate odd arrivals and departures without knowing the full story. I bought coffee for the receptionist and listened when she complained about how HR always favored certain players. Those small human debts came back later in tiny confirmations. Yeah, he left with someone around midnight. Or, I saw him run to his car at 11:45 p.m. Nothing dramatic on its own, but stitches that would hold the larger fabric together. I also started shaping Brittany's narrative gently, not forcing but offering a safe place to speak when she was ready. I never pushed her to confess. I asked her about her work, her goals, and what she was afraid of losing. I told stories about mentors who helped women not by using them, but by advocating for them. Slowly, she began to tell me things. Small details at first, then clearer admissions. Each time she spoke, I validated her, never judged, always listening. She let me copy a few innocuous contacts at first, and later, when she trusted me more, she allowed me to back up photos and texts from her phone. I treated that material like a sacred thing, never sharing it without her consent, never weaponizing it beyond what we needed to prove a pattern. Her agreement to participate came with a trembling bravery that steadied me more than I expected. It was one thing to orchestrate revenge for principle. It was another to help someone reclaim power over a life they'd been bullied into silence about. That made every plan feel righteous. I worked the HR angle too. I didn't want to go to HR empty-handed, not when I had so much more at risk than he did. Instead, I built a plausible scenario where HR would be forced to act, documented performance discrepancies he'd manufactured, timestamps proving he had lied about my work, and clear proof of his double standards. I seeded anonymous tips about his favoritism long enough before the reveal that HR would treat initial notes as routine complaints rather than explosive revelations. When I finally exposed the deeper stuff, it would arrive like an unavoidable forensic report, not the hysterical rant of an employee. I also made sure to identify who in HR might be sympathetic, someone who once had a messy supervisor, someone who valued fairness over politics, small conversations, casual coffee breaks, mentions of legal articles I'd read on workplace conduct, all subtle ways to normalize the topic and find allies without revealing my full hand. The charity event became the focal point of the plan. With Melissa scheduled to attend and with most of the company in one place, the optics were perfect, public, visible, and filled with colleagues who could witness the truth without the chance to gaslight later. But I needed one more layer, an incontrovertible moment tying him to choices and places he'd lied about. So I orchestrated a small sting. I arranged for a fake, after-hours client meeting to appear on the calendar, something plausible and boring, the kind of thing David would put on his schedule to justify an absence. I asked a friend in IT to confirm a security camera sweep for that time, and had the front desk log a visitor at a particular hour. Those details would later align with a motel receipt and a direct message screenshot that showed the unmistakable coordination of two willing adults. I made sure every piece of that puzzle had corroboration from at least two independent sources. I understood the game. He would deny, lie, and shift blame. The only way to win was to present a case so neat and cross-checked that denial would look absurd. Finally, the night before the planned reveal, I sat alone at my kitchen table with hot tea gone cold, the flash drives stacked like quiet evidence between my hands. For a moment I imagined sending everything immediately, watching his life collapse within hours. But then I saw Melissa's face again, warm, unguarded, and remembered why I started. This wasn't about delighting in destruction. It was about stopping a man who believed power meant impunity. It was about giving a woman the truth she deserved with dignity and a path forward that wasn't merely wrath. So I double-checked the timestamps, encrypted the files, and set them to release at a time when HR couldn't ignore them. I prepared a short, factual cover letter to send with the files. No sensational language, no accusations without evidence, just a clear, documented trail. Then I slept 3 hours, waking with a focus that felt like a muscle finally flexed for the first time in months. The plan began not as vengeance, but as righting a wrong. When the system moved, There would be no room for his spin, only a ledger of choices he had made. I started playing his game the way a chess player plays an opponent who underestimates them. Calm, patient, and always 3 moves ahead. I went to work every morning with a smile that felt like armor. When David walked by, I nodded like a grateful pupil. When he praised me in front of staff, I blushed just enough to make him feel seen. Privately, I cataloged everything. I answered his messages promptly, scheduled mentorship lunches, and positioned myself near his calendar so I could see what he was booking. I volunteered for client after client, not because I wanted praise, but because I'd learned that proximity made opportunities, and opportunities made evidence. If he assumed I wanted power, he'd keep pulling me into the same orbit where his behavior was most visible. If he assumed I was pliable, he'd let his guard down. That was the plan. There were moments that felt like playing with fire. He would lean in too close during presentations and make a joke about how the right woman could turn a business deal into a lifelong partnership. He once slipped a hand across my back to guide me through a doorway, and the sting of that contact stayed with me all day. But every time he crossed the line, I treated it like a clue instead of a wound. I recorded conversations where it was legal, kept copies of messages he sent from both email and private chat, and made sure the timestamps were clear. I learned the little things, the way he always left his desk unsecured while he walked to HR, the password hint he used on his calendar, the nicknames he used for certain people in DMs. Those small details would become the threads that, when pulled, unraveled the whole sweater. Brittany was the hardest piece to manage because she was terrified. She flinched whenever he called her name, and she'd avoid the eye contact of someone who'd been taught to make herself small. So I was careful. I offered her a path rather than an ultimatum. When she showed up to work with a swollen lip and said she tripped on the sidewalk, I didn't push. Instead, I brought her coffee and asked about her weekend in a way that let her choose what to tell me. Slowly, she gave. A text here, a screenshot there, an admission in whispers between the copier and the break room. Each piece of her story fit into the bigger puzzle. He had patterns, not accidents. He had favored young women and rewarded silence with small raises and promises of mentorship. He had convinced them to go along until they didn't know where they ended, and the opportunity began. Helping her collect those artifacts was, secretly, the thing that steadied me. It made the plan less about vengeance and more about righting a wrong. Playing along also required manipulation of optics. I knew the company's rumor mill and how HR reacted to certain words. I couldn't be the woman who stormed into HR and cried abuse. That's the version that gets labeled unstable, emotional, and unreliable. Instead, I curated a record. I let people see me as hardworking, slightly naive, someone who accepted mentorship and took notes. I made sure to be visible in other ways that would cast doubt on any narrative that I was acting alone. Coffee runs with the receptionist, lunches with the accountant, friendly texts with the office manager. I cultivated allies by doing small favors, covering someone's shift, bringing a cake for someone's birthday, lending my notes to an intern. Those tiny social credits came back when it counted. "Oh, I ran into Madison at the elevator after hours," the receptionist would say. She seemed fine. That kind of comment could be spun, but pooled with the forensic documents I was collecting, it would be a stitch in a much larger tapestry. One night, I let myself cross a line I'd avoided. I walked into his office after hours with my laptop and a confidence that felt foreign. He was there, alone, phone on the desk, a half-empty bottle of whiskey in the drawer. He didn't see me at first. He was on a call, using a voice that was tender in a way he never was with clients. He said things I recorded without a second thought. When the call ended, he turned and smiled like I was the evening's reward. "What are you doing here, Madison?" he asked, closing the door behind him. "I thought you had an early meeting." I shrugged, changed my mind. I sat across from him and acted tired, pliant. He poured us both a drink. "You're different," he said softly. "You're honest." I nodded. "I try to be." He reached out and rested his hand over mine, his fingers warm and confident. He thought he had me. He didn't know he had given me what I needed. The charity event's countdown made every move more urgent. I tightened the timeline, coordinating the release of files so that HR would be forced to act during the company's own event, rather than when they could bury it in a quiet week. I made sure the copies were in safe hands, 2 encrypted drives stored in separate locations, copies uploaded to a private cloud accessible only by me, and physical prints hidden in a locked desk at a friend's house. The day before the event, I rehearsed my story in front of the mirror until it stopped shaking. I'd chosen language that was factual and tight. No florid accusations, no dramatic flourishes, because facts are harder to gaslight. I practiced saying dates, times, and places without emotion. It felt strange at first, like prepping a deposition about my own life, but the rehearsal brought clarity. Clarity turned fear into resolve. There were moments when the weight of what I was doing pressed down. I worried about Brittany and the fallout she'd face if the plan failed. I worried about Melissa and the private pain she would experience when the truth came out. I worried about myself, what it would mean to become the woman who brought a man's life crashing down. But then I remembered the nights I'd seen David leave with someone at midnight, the mornings he'd call in sick after public dinners, the little lies that had accumulated into a life built on denial. Those memories sharpened my purpose. This wasn't just about punishment. It was about accountability. It was about showing a man who believed his charm granted him immunity that actions have consequences. So I kept smiling at work. I kept taking notes when he spoke. I kept answering his texts with exactly the right tone. And when he finally slipped on the charity event night, when he dashed to the parking lot with someone on his arm and forgot to close his browser with the incriminating message still visible, I had already built the scaffolding to make that one moment impossible to explain away. The game he thought he'd been playing was over. He'd underestimated who he was playing against, and I had waited until the board was set so that when I moved, everything would fall into place. Collecting proof felt less like detective work and more like learning a new language, one that used timestamps and metadata instead of verbs and adjectives. I started by cataloging everything I already had: the restaurant recording, the late-night parking videos, Brittany's screenshots. Then I widened the portfolio to include things that couldn't be shrugged off as coincidence. I printed out hotel confirmations with names and dates, cross-referenced them with security logs from the building, and saved calendar invites that placed David at odd meetings at odd hours. I asked small favors that looked harmless. Could HR double-check a calendar entry? Could the receptionist glance at the sign-in sheet from the lobby? Each favor left a trail of ordinary bureaucracy that, when stitched together, would make a pattern that even a practiced liar would find hard to unknot. The more I arranged, the more the invisible scaffolding held. Sometimes collecting proof meant being patient. Other times it meant taking risks that tasted like iron in my mouth. There were nights when I stayed in the office until the cleaning crew left, then sneaked into David's unlocked inbox to find drafts he thought no one else would ever see. I told myself those invasions had purpose, and that purpose justified the edges I crossed. But I also made rules for myself. No fabrication, never alter a single file, never do anything that would make my evidence inadmissible. I kept a running mental ledger of legality, because the worst betrayal would be to do something so reckless that my own hands would get tied when it mattered most. Brittany became both the softest and the hardest part of this. She was terrified of being judged, terrified of losing her job, terrified of how small the world would feel if everyone knew. I spent afternoons teaching her how to back up messages without panicking, how to export a conversation, save the metadata, lock the phone in a drawer. She learned quickly because survival sharpens muscles that otherwise go unused. There was one afternoon she brought me a file with shaking hands and an apology on her lips. "I shouldn't give this to you," she whispered, eyes bright. "But I don't know who else to trust." I hugged her, which felt like the most important defense either of us had. We set ground rules. She could rescind consent at any time. Nothing would be used without a plan. We would protect her identity until she was ready. Her courage was messy and beautiful and real, and it made everything less about me and more about the lives being affected. Not all proof came from screenshots and receipts. Some of it came from patterns of behavior, little lies that multiplied into a life built on half-truths. David would tell people he was in meetings when his phone logs would show him in a different zip code. He would claim client dinners that never existed. He had favorite euphemisms, phrases he used when he wanted to make something sound professional, phrases I learned to recognize and which I collected like teeth. When I presented my case later, those phrases would be as damning as any explicit message because they revealed intent, habit, and the veneer he used to spin stories for coworkers and family alike. As the evidence stack grew, so did my paranoia. I began to watch my own reflection for signs of being watched back. I changed passwords, used burner emails to send evidence to myself, and set encrypted backups to sync at odd hours so that no one could accuse me of planting things after the fact. I kept a carbon copy of every file in a physical folder hidden at Janelle's apartment, the kind of old-school precaution that felt both ridiculous and necessary in a world that lived in the cloud. Sometimes I would walk past David's office and freeze, imagining him sitting inside, pretending to work, already whispering about the woman who dared to double-cross him. I wanted to catch him before he had the chance to retaliate in ways deeper than firing. Lawsuits, legal harassment, smear campaigns. Men with money think of defenses I don't, but I tried to predict their playbook and plan counters. There were close calls that tightened my chest and made my hands shake for days. Once, I missent an encrypted file to my own work email instead of my burner and watched in horror as Outlook flagged it. I spent the next hour composing an innocent explanation in my head for why I had a strange attachment, then deleted it from the server and prayed no backup had caught it. Once David called me into his office to talk about the Johnson account, and for 40 minutes he used charm like a net, trying to lure me into casual admission. He wanted to know what I knew without incriminating himself. I answered with neutral facts, letting him believe he'd calmed me. After he left, I sat at my desk and cried. Not from weakness, but from the exhaustion of carrying a secret that felt like lead. At the same time, lies multiplied around him the way rats multiply in an old house. He lied about his whereabouts, about meetings, about why certain people were given perks he denied others. He told HR that I was sulking and disengaged, inventing terms that could be used to discredit me at performance reviews. His web was social as well as procedural. He cultivated friends in the right places, smiled on camera, and drop-fed the office rumor mill with stories that made him look like a harsh but fair leader. I cataloged those lies too, because pattern is proof. When someone consistently paints themselves as the hero, while the records show a different story, those contradictions become a map. One night, while I was cataloging a batch of text messages from David, my laptop battery died. I swear I could feel the moment of silence like a physical thing. I ran to the supply closet for a charger, fingers trembling, and when I returned, the office lights had been dimmed, and the cleaning crew was sweeping. I zipped my files to the cloud and left with a calm that felt staged. As I drove home, the city lights blurred, and my thoughts went to Melissa's face. The way she had hugged me like an old friend. The way her voice still had the soft cadence of someone who believed in goodness. I thought of Brittany, who slept without ease and checked her phone with the steady dread of someone waiting for a verdict. I thought of what would happen if everything went wrong. Lawsuits, backlash, people telling me I'd overstepped. I would have to live with that if it came to pass. But I knew, bone deep, that living with a guilty conscience from silence would be worse. The last step before the reveal was the hardest, building an explanation that could stand up to scrutiny without sounding like revenge. I wrote a timeline, dates, times, places, names, clear and clinical. I attached copies of files, labeled and cross-checked. I rehearsed my words in the mirror until I could say them without shaking. And then, late one night, I sent a secure copy to an attorney Danny recommended, an independent woman who said she would look at the case without promises, but with clear eyes. That message pinged like a bell in my chest, and then quieted. The files were out of my immediate control, and that gave me a terror that was its own kind of relief. The web I had woven was tight now, resilient and cold. Lies had met proof, and proof was patient. When the truth began to move, it would not stutter. When it hit, it would land like a mirror shattering in a silent room. The night of the charity dinner felt like stepping into a movie I'd been directing in secret. Everything glittered on the surface. String lights draped across the ballroom ceiling, the clink of glasses, laughter bouncing off marble floors. The company had gone all out. There were white roses at every table, waiters weaving through the crowd with champagne trays, and a jazz trio playing just loud enough to drown out awkward silences. Everyone was dressed to impress, including me. I'd chosen a navy dress, sharp but simple, hair pinned back tight like armor. Janelle helped me pick it, saying, "You're not going to war. You're going to win." David spotted me almost immediately. His smile was the kind that came with ownership. "Madison," he said. offering his arm like we were old friends. "You look incredible." His wife, Melissa, stood just a few steps away, greeting other guests with that soft, radiant grace that made people love her instantly. I forced myself to look at him like I still cared about his approval. "Thank you," I said lightly. "This is a beautiful event." Melissa really outdid herself. He gave a small laugh. "She's got a good eye for this kind of thing." Then, lowering his voice, he added, "Stick close tonight. We'll talk business later." That was exactly what I needed him to say, because that talk would be the noose he didn't know he was tying. I excused myself and made my way to the back of the room, where Brittany was waiting near the dessert table, hands shaking around a glass of water. "You ready?" I asked quietly. She nodded, her voice barely a whisper. "I uploaded everything. It's set to go live when you give the signal." I squeezed her hand. "Good. Just breathe. After tonight, you're free." The plan was simple, but merciless. At 8:45 p.m., while the CEO was giving his speech, a scheduled email from my encrypted account would send a folder of evidence to HR, the board, and, most importantly, Melissa Hayes. The files contained everything: recordings, messages, receipts, photos, calendar entries. Every lie, every manipulation, every predatory word. The moment the clock hit 8:45, the truth would start unraveling. But until then, I had to keep my composure. I took my seat near the front, across the room from the Hayes family table. Melissa caught my eye once and smiled, the kind of smile that hit me like a punch because she didn't know what was about to happen. I felt guilty for half a second, but then I reminded myself, she deserved the truth. Lies rot everything they touch. She deserved a life that wasn't built on one. The speech began. David sat tall, hand resting on Melissa's chair, his picture-perfect family smiling for the cameras. The CEO droned on about integrity and trust, words that made my throat tighten. I checked my phone under the table. 8:42. My palms were sweating. I took a sip of water, fingers trembling. 8:44. I looked around the room, people laughing, nodding, oblivious. Brittany caught my eye from across the table, biting her lip, waiting. 8:45. The vibration in my pocket was small but seismic. One notification, then another, then another. I didn't look at them. I didn't have to. The plan was in motion. At first, nothing happened. David leaned over to whisper something in Melissa's ear. She laughed. The jazz band played another cheerful tune. For a moment, I thought maybe it failed, that my email hadn't sent, or the attachments were too large. But then I saw it. Across the room, Melissa's phone lit up. She glanced at it, smiled absently, and then her face changed. It wasn't slow. It was immediate. She blinked, scrolled, her smile faltered. Her eyes darted sideways toward David. He noticed her reaction, leaned closer, murmured something, trying to keep her calm. But she was no longer hearing him. She was reading. Her expression went from confusion to disbelief to something colder. Recognition. I saw the exact moment her jaw set, the moment her shoulders straightened. She stood up, just like that. Mid-speech, mid-dinner, in front of everyone. The room went silent except for the faint clatter of a fork dropping somewhere. "Melissa?" David said, standing too. She stared at him, phone in hand. Her voice didn't shake. "How long?" she asked. The microphone on the stage caught it, projected it through the speakers for the entire ballroom to hear. A murmur rippled through the crowd. "What are you talking about?" he asked, his face tightening. "Sit down." But she didn't. She stepped closer, holding up the phone. "How long, David?" He tried to grab her wrist, but she pulled away. "Don't do this here," he hissed. "Please." "Here's perfect," she said. "It's where you built the lie." The CEO froze mid-sentence, unsure whether to intervene. People were whispering now, phones discreetly recording. I could feel my pulse in my fingertips. David's composure cracked. "You're making a scene," he said, voice low but sharp. "You're embarrassing yourself." She laughed, a dry, broken sound that sliced the silence in half. "No, David, I think you did that for me." Then she turned, walked straight out of the ballroom, heels clicking like gunshots. David followed her, but before he reached the door, one of the board members stood in his way, a tall man with a tight smile. He held his phone up and said, "You might want to check your inbox." That was when the dam burst. People started whispering louder, looking at their screens, exchanging looks of disbelief and disgust. The CEO stepped off the stage, heading toward HR. Brittany caught my eye again, tears streaming down her cheeks. Not of fear this time, but relief. I sat still, hands folded, breathing slow and steady. For the first time in months, I didn't feel trapped. I felt the weight lifting off me piece by piece, like exhaling after holding your breath underwater. My phone buzzed again. A message from my attorney. "Got it. Everything's time-stamped. You're protected." In the chaos, David disappeared. Maybe he chased Melissa. Maybe he ran to his office to try to control the fallout. It didn't matter. The truth was out. And once truth starts moving, it doesn't stop. It spreads, reshapes, burns. By the time the event ended, everyone knew. His charm was gone. His empire was cracking. And I just stood near the door, watching the crowd part around me, and whispered to myself, "Checkmate." The Monday after the charity dinner felt like the morning after a storm, the kind that tears through in the night, and when you wake up, nothing looks the same. The office was quieter than I'd ever heard it. People whispered in corners, eyes darting toward the glass walls of the executive floor where blinds were now permanently closed. There was no laughter, no casual small talk by the coffee machine. Just the thick hum of tension, like everyone was waiting for the next shoe to drop. I walked in at 8:01 sharp, holding my coffee, pretending not to notice the stares. That was the disguise. Normalcy. Calm. Composure. The woman who had nothing to hide. David's name was already being whispered like a curse. "Did you see the emails?" I heard the board suspended him. His wife walked out. Everyone had a different version of the story, each one more dramatic than the last. I kept my head down and focused on my screen, scrolling through spreadsheets that didn't matter anymore. I'd done my job. The truth was out. But part of me knew the game wasn't over. Not yet, because men like David don't disappear quietly. At 9:15, HR sent out an email titled "Urgent," all staff meeting at 10 a.m. That kind of subject line can drain color from a whole office. Everyone looked up at once. I glanced toward Brittany's desk. She was pale, eyes wide, biting her lip. I gave her a small nod. We were in this together now, and we both knew the next hour could change everything. When we walked into the conference room, the air was electric with gossip and fear. The head of HR, a woman named Karen who'd spent years defending executives with empty smiles, stood at the front beside two board members. Her tone was measured, careful, rehearsed. As many of you may have heard, allegations have surfaced regarding misconduct involving a senior member of management. Effective immediately, David Hayes has been placed on administrative leave pending an internal investigation. She paused, scanning the room. We want to assure everyone that this company does not tolerate inappropriate behavior of any kind. If anyone has relevant information, please reach out directly to HR or our outside legal team. The words hung in the air like smoke. No one moved. Karen's smile flickered, then returned. We will maintain professionalism and continue our work as usual. Work as usual. Sure. When the meeting ended, people scattered fast, some whispering, some avoiding eye contact altogether. I lingered near the back, watching Karen. She was gathering papers, pretending to be composed. As the room emptied, I stepped closer. "If you need statements, I have information that might help your investigation," I said quietly. Her eyes flicked up, assessing me. "Thank you, Madison," she said carefully. "We'll be in touch." But I could tell she already knew. She'd seen the emails, heard the recordings. My name was probably all over them. Back at my desk, I opened my laptop and checked my personal email. There were dozens of unread messages, reporters, lawyers, other women from the company thanking me anonymously. One said, "You don't know me, but I saw what you did. You saved us." I didn't cry, though I wanted to. Instead, I closed my inbox and stared at my reflection in the black screen. I didn't look like a hero. I looked tired, hollow, but beneath the exhaustion was something stronger: peace. By noon, the rumors had morphed into headlines. Local executive under investigation for misconduct at Dallas marketing firm. News trucks were parked across the street. Employees peeked through blinds, whispering like kids in a classroom. HR sent out another email reminding us not to speak to the media, but the damage was done. Truth spreads faster than silence. Around 2 o'clock, a message from David appeared in my inbox. Just one line. "You think you won?" My stomach clenched. I read it again, then again, before forwarding it straight to my lawyer. He was still trying to control the narrative, to make me flinch. But I wasn't the same girl who froze in the conference room months ago. I was done being afraid. I replied with 2 words. Stop contacting me. That evening, as I was packing up to leave, Brittany came over, eyes full of tears. "He called me," she whispered, "from a different number. He said he could make all this go away if I stayed quiet." I felt the heat rise in my chest, the same cold rage that had pushed me to act in the first place. "You don't answer him again," I said firmly. "If he calls, if he texts, if he even breathes near you, you tell me, and you tell your lawyer. You're safe now, you hear me?" She nodded, wiping her face. "I just want this to be over." "It will be," I promised. Soon. As I stepped outside into the cool Dallas evening, the city lights looked different, sharper, clearer, like I was seeing them for the first time. I passed one of the reporters standing near the corner. She looked at me curiously, microphone in hand, and asked, "Do you work here? Can you comment on Mr. Hayes?" I stopped, looked her straight in the eye, and said, "No comment." My voice didn't shake. At home, I poured myself a glass of wine and sat on the balcony, watching traffic below. My phone buzzed with messages I ignored. Janelle came out with a blanket and sat beside me in silence for a while. Then she said softly, "You did it." I shook my head. "Not yet." "What do you mean?" she asked. I stared out at the skyline, lights flickering like quiet applause. He's still out there. He still thinks he can rewrite the story, but the truth's out now, and you can't unsee the truth once it's in daylight. For the first time in months, I allowed myself to breathe. Really breathe. I'd been wearing masks for so long that peace felt almost foreign. But beneath the calm, I could sense the next phase forming. HR would investigate. Lawyers would dig. And eventually, the board would decide his fate. Until then, I'd stay steady, quiet, invisible. Let them underestimate me one last time. Because while everyone else was busy reacting, I was already planning my final move. The one that would make sure he never hurt another woman again. The leak started like everything else in this story. Quietly, then all at once. By Tuesday morning, our office was trending on Twitter. Someone had sent the full folder of files, not the redacted HR version but the raw evidence, to a journalist from the Dallas Ledger. Screenshots, audio clips, timestamps, everything. Within hours, half the city knew David Hayes' name, and by noon, his face was plastered on every local news site. The headlines didn't pull punches. Executive exploits female staffers in exchange for promotions. Company under fire after viral exposure of workplace misconduct. The story spread like wildfire. My phone wouldn't stop buzzing. Emails, calls, texts from unknown numbers. Reporters, lawyers, strangers thanking me. Trolls calling me names. I muted everything. I couldn't afford to break focus. At work, the atmosphere was chaos. HR locked down access to company files, and IT disabled external drives. Employees stood in clusters, whispering in shock. The CEO sent out a statement around 10 a.m., using phrases like "deeply concerned" and "zero tolerance." They promised an independent review, which everyone knew meant they were just trying to survive the PR nightmare. People looked at me differently now, some with respect, some with pity, some with fear. It's funny how fast people shift when they realize you're capable of burning down a system they thought was untouchable. Brittany didn't come in that morning. She texted me instead. "He showed up at my apartment last night. I didn't open the door. The cops are involved." My heart dropped. I called her immediately, but she didn't answer. I left a message, trying to keep my voice calm even though my hands were shaking. Then I called my sister, Danny. "He's spiraling," I said. "He's going to do something stupid." Danny's tone was cold, steady. "Then we make sure the system sees it. Don't confront him yourself. Document everything. Every threat, every call, every knock at your door." By afternoon, the company's lobby was swarming with reporters. Security guards escorted employees through side exits. I sat at my desk, headphones in, pretending to work while emails pinged nonstop. HR had called for another all-staff meeting at 4. My stomach twisted. I didn't know whether they were going to thank me, fire me, or both. Around 3, my lawyer called. "You need to go home," she said. "It's about to get uglier. The story's gone national. CNN picked it up. They're using your initials. It's only a matter of time before people figure out who you are." I stared at my monitor, the cursor blinking in a half-written email. "If I leave now," I said, "they'll think I'm running." "You're not running," she said gently. "You're protecting yourself." I shut down my computer, grabbed my bag, and walked out. My heart pounded with every step toward the elevator. A few coworkers nodded at me. Some avoided my eyes. One whispered, "Good luck." When the doors closed, I finally let out a breath I didn't realize I was holding. Outside, the air was heavy with Texas heat. Reporters hovered near the entrance, microphones ready. One of them shouted my name, not my initials, my name. "Madison, do you have a comment about the leaked files?" The world spun for half a second. Someone had confirmed it. My identity was no longer private. Cameras flashed. Questions flew. I pushed past them, slid into my car, locked the doors, and drove. By the time I reached my apartment, the story was everywhere. My face wasn't on TV yet, but my LinkedIn profile was screenshot across Twitter threads. Some people called me brave. Others called me a liar, an attention seeker, a homewrecker pretending to be a hero. It hurt. God, it hurt. But I didn't have the luxury of falling apart. I turned off my phone and opened my laptop to check on Brittany's texts. Finally, a new message appeared. "I'm safe. They arrested him." I stared at those words, my body going weak with relief. Arrested. That word sounded like justice, even if it was temporary. An hour later, my lawyer confirmed it. David Hayes had been detained after showing up at Brittany's apartment, pounding on her door, screaming about how she ruined his life. Neighbors called 911. The cops found him drunk, incoherent, and belligerent. He spent the night in county lockup. The official story broke soon after. Former marketing executive arrested following misconduct allegations. His mugshot hit the news cycle like a grenade. The man who once strutted around the office in $1,000 suits now looked small, disheveled, defeated. I watched the footage from my couch, knees pulled to my chest. It should have felt satisfying, seeing him stripped of power, the lies collapsing around him. But it didn't. It just felt heavy, like all the air had been sucked out of the room. Janelle came home halfway through the news broadcast. She didn't say anything at first. She just sat beside me and turned the volume down. "You did what had to be done," she said softly. "Don't let them make you feel bad for it." "I don't feel bad," I said, though part of me did. Not for him. Never for him. But for Melissa. For the kids. For Brittany. For everyone dragged into this mess. I just wish it didn't have to be this way. "Maybe it always has to be this way before it gets better," she said. That night, I stood on my balcony and watched the city lights shimmer in the distance. The noise of traffic, sirens, and summer air filled the silence that used to suffocate me. I thought about the first day I saw him cross that line, how powerless I'd felt. And now, standing there, I realized that power doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers. Sometimes it's just the quiet decision not to look away. When I went to bed, I left my phone on silent, but messages still poured in. Reporters, advocates, strangers, victims. Some wanted details, some wanted help, some just wanted to say thank you. The world had seen the story now. It wasn't mine anymore. It belonged to every woman who'd been told to smile through discomfort, to stay quiet for the sake of professionalism. And as I drifted off to sleep, one thought lingered like a heartbeat. He thought he could silence me with fear. But fear, once faced, has nowhere left to hide. The day they called me to the courthouse, the sky was gray in that flat, metallic way that makes everything look colder. My lawyer said I didn't have to go, that my statement and the evidence already spoke louder than any testimony I could give, but something inside me needed to see it through. I'd started this story, and I wasn't going to let it end in paperwork and headlines. I wanted to look him in the eye one last time, not out of vengeance, but because closure, for me, meant standing in the same room as the man who thought he could break me and realizing he never had that power. The courthouse smelled like old wood and nerves. Reporters gathered outside like vultures, their cameras aimed at every person who walked through the doors. I kept my head down, my lawyer beside me, her hand occasionally brushing my arm to steady me. Inside, the waiting area buzzed with whispers. I could feel people's eyes on me, but I didn't care. This wasn't about them. When the bailiff called his name, David Hayes, case number 31472, I felt a strange stillness wash over me. He entered the courtroom in handcuffs, escorted by 2 officers. The man who once towered over everyone now looked smaller somehow, deflated. His hair was messy, his face pale and unshaven. When his eyes met mine, there was a flicker, shock, maybe shame, but it vanished as quickly as it came. He tried to straighten his shoulders, to summon that familiar arrogance, but it just looked sad now, like watching a broken actor trying to remember his lines. The judge read the charges: harassment, intimidation, misconduct, obstruction. Each word landed heavy, final. David's lawyer whispered in his ear, and he nodded mechanically. When asked for a plea, he said, "Not guilty," his voice flat, but loud enough for the room to hear. My lawyer leaned toward me. "Don't react," she murmured. I didn't. I kept my face calm, eyes steady. Inside, though, my pulse was pounding. Not guilty. The same man who had spent months manipulating, threatening, and degrading women still couldn't admit the truth, even when it was staring him in the face. Then something unexpected happened. During a recess, as people shuffled out to stretch and whisper, one of the officers motioned for me to wait by the side door. "He wants to speak with you," she said quietly. "Off the record." My lawyer immediately objected. "Absolutely not." But I raised my hand. "It's okay," I said. "I'll keep it short." She gave me a look that said she thought I was crazy, but she didn't stop me. They led me into a small holding room behind the courtroom. The air was thick and still, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. He was sitting at a metal table, wrists cuffed in front of him. When he looked up, the smirk was gone. "You got what you wanted," he said finally. His voice was low, cracked. "You destroyed me." I stood there, arms crossed. "No," I said evenly. "You destroyed yourself." He laughed bitterly. "You think you're some kind of hero?" His voice was rising now. "You think they'll thank you? They'll forget you. They'll move on. And you'll still be the girl who made a scene." I let him talk. He needed to hear his own desperation. "You spent your whole life thinking no one would ever hold you accountable," I said quietly. "You built your career on fear, on silence, on women being too scared to speak up. You picked the wrong one this time." For the first time since I'd known him, he didn't have a comeback. He just stared at me, jaw tight, eyes bloodshot. "You don't understand what this'll cost you," he muttered. "They'll dig into your life, twist everything. They'll make you the villain." "Maybe," I said, "but at least I can sleep at night." He leaned back in his chair, shaking his head like he couldn't comprehend how he'd lost control of the narrative. "You think anyone's perfect, Madison? You think you're innocent?" "I never said I was," I replied. "But I never hurt people to feel powerful. That's the difference." For a moment the room went quiet, except for the hum of the lights. Then the guard opened the door to signal our time was up. I turned to leave, but he called after me. "You'll regret this," he said, his voice low, venomous. "You'll see." I stopped in the doorway and looked back at him one last time. "Maybe," I said, "but you'll never scare anyone again." The door closed between us with a heavy thud that echoed down the hallway. Outside, the air smelled like rain. My lawyer caught up to me on the courthouse steps. "Are you okay?" she asked. I nodded slowly. "Yeah," I said. "For the first time, I think I am." Reporters were still waiting by the gates, shouting questions, snapping photos. I didn't answer any of them. I just walked to my car, the sky beginning to drizzle, each drop cooling the heat that had lived in my chest for months. When I slid into the driver's seat, I took one long, steady breath. It didn't feel like victory. It felt like release. As I drove home, I passed the office building where this all began, the glass windows reflecting a cloudy sky. I thought about the girl I used to be, sitting at that desk, afraid to speak up, afraid to lose her job, and I realized something. She wasn't gone. She'd just evolved. She'd learned that sometimes justice isn't about winning. It's about refusing to stay silent when silence is what feeds the monster. When I got home, I checked my phone. A message from Brittany was waiting. He's gone. They're saying he'll take a plea. Thank you. I smiled for the first time that day. Not because it was over, but because it finally mattered. Because the truth had a heartbeat now, and it wouldn't stop echoing long after the headlines faded. The weeks that followed felt like a strange blend of triumph and exhaustion, like coming down from a high you never wanted in the first place. The company moved fast, faster than anyone expected. Within 10 days of David's arraignment, his name was scrubbed from the company website. They issued a second statement to the press, full of corporate contrition and promises of new standards for workplace conduct. HR was restructured, managers shuffled, and someone new took his office. The same corner space that had once looked like power. Now it just looked like a tomb. His framed photo with Melissa and the kids was gone, replaced by a vase of fake flowers and a plaque about teamwork. Every time I passed that glass wall, I felt a chill crawl up my spine. It was as if the building itself wanted to forget him. But memory has its own agenda. Reporters kept digging, bloggers kept spinning the story, and everyone wanted a piece of me. I got used to the cameras outside my apartment, to the journalists who camped near the parking lot pretending they were just doing their jobs. I stopped opening my door unless I knew the voice on the other side. Online, I was both villain and hero. People I'd never met called me brave, called me stupid, called me every name you can imagine. Some said I'd ruined a man's life for attention. Others said I'd changed the world for women everywhere. The truth was quieter than all of that. I just told what happened. The company offered me a promotion, a new position in ethics and compliance. The irony wasn't lost on me. My lawyer told me to take time to think about it. You could change things from the inside, she said. But all I could think about was how much that building still smelled like fear. I told her I'd decide after the investigation wrapped. Meanwhile, Melissa disappeared from public view. No interviews, no statements. One day, a mutual friend from college texted me a link, a new listing for a small home outside Austin. Her name was on it. I took that as a good sign. She was starting over. She'd filed for divorce quietly, without fanfare, and had kept custody of the kids. It made me weirdly proud, even though I hadn't spoken to her since that night at the dinner. I wrote her a letter once, telling her I was sorry for the pain, but not for the truth. I never mailed it. It didn't feel like my place to decide what closure looked like for her. Brittany, on the other hand, started to bloom. She transferred to a different department, started taking night classes, and even cut her hair short, like a symbolic shedding of everything she'd been through. Sometimes we'd grab coffee, talk about ordinary things. She'd smile more, laugh easier, and I realized that maybe survival doesn't always look like strength. Sometimes it just looks like breathing freely again. But not everything healed neatly. A few male colleagues avoided me completely, afraid of saying the wrong thing. Others tried too hard to show support, their guilt written across forced smiles. HR kept sending sensitivity training invitations that nobody wanted to attend. I became the walking reminder of everything uncomfortable, the living proof that silence could cost careers. I hated the attention but understood it was part of the price. The company's PR machine spun the story hard, painting themselves as a model of reform. New policies were rolled out. New committees formed. They even brought in a consultant to lead workshops about empowerment and equality. It all looked impressive on paper, but when I walked those hallways, I still saw hesitation in women's eyes, still heard the careful laughter when men spoke too loud. Culture doesn't shift overnight. It moves inch by inch, held back by old habits and quiet fears. My lawyer, Danny, called one evening just as I was finishing dinner. He took the plea, she said. My fork paused mid-air. What kind of deal? 1 year probation, counseling, barred from managing teams for 5 years. I felt both relief and fury. After everything, after the pain, the lies, the threats, he'd get to walk free. That's it, I whispered. That's justice? Danny sighed. It's what the system allows. But don't mistake leniency for victory. He'll never work in this town again. And his name is a warning now. She was right. Even with the light sentence, the damage was irreversible. Every search result, every headline tied his name to scandal. The empire he built on charm and intimidation had crumbled. There were rumors he'd moved out of state, that Melissa refused to see him, that he was living with his brother in Oklahoma, avoiding cameras. The thought didn't bring satisfaction, just quiet finality. Monsters lose their power when the lights stay on long enough. Around that time, I started therapy. My counselor, a woman named Celeste, asked me one question in our first session. "What do you want to feel at the end of this?" I said, "Nothing." She smiled softly. "Then that's where we'll start." Over the weeks that followed, I learned how to untangle the guilt from the justice, the fear from the control. I learned that healing isn't a straight line. It's a spiral that loops back to the same pain until you finally learn to hold it differently. One night, months later, I drove past the courthouse again. It was empty, quiet, bathed in streetlight. I parked for a while, just staring. Somewhere inside that building was a folder with my name on it, my statements, my evidence, proof that I'd once stood up when it would have been easier to sit down. I thought about deleting every digital copy of the case from my drives. Then I stopped. Maybe some stories aren't meant to vanish. Maybe they're meant to stay as warnings, as armor, as reminders. When I got home, I poured a glass of wine and opened my laptop. The cursor blinked on an empty page. I started typing. Not evidence this time, not statements, just words, memories, feelings. I didn't know if it would become a book, a blog, or just therapy through the keyboard, but I needed to put it somewhere. Because silence, once broken, can't be forced back into its box. By midnight, I wrote the sentence that summed it all up. He thought the truth would destroy me, but it set me free. Then I closed the laptop, leaned back, and let myself finally rest. For the first time in a long time, the night didn't feel heavy. It just felt quiet. It wasn't until after everything settled, the court dates, the headlines, the endless noise, that the real reason I'd done all this finally surfaced. Not the professional justification, not the feminist rhetoric, not even the loyalty to other women. The truth sat quieter and deeper than all that, tucked behind years of memories I'd tried to forget. It started with a phone call one Sunday morning, a number I didn't recognize flashing across my screen. When I answered, a voice I hadn't heard in almost a decade said my name. "Madison?" It was Claire. My mother's voice, tired and fragile, but still hers. We hadn't spoken much since I left home. Growing up in a small town outside Houston, I'd watched her disappear piece by piece into my father's control. He'd been a cop, respected, loud, proud, and behind closed doors, cruel in a way the world never saw. My mother had spent half her life apologizing for bruises she didn't cause, for words she never said. The night I turned 16, I called the police myself, but they never showed. "He's one of ours," the dispatcher had said. Like that explained everything. The next morning, my mother made me pack and go live with an aunt, whispering, "Be smarter than me." I hadn't seen her since. Now, after all these years, she was calling me. "I saw you on the news," she said softly. "I wasn't sure if it was really you, but when I heard your voice," she trailed off, and I could hear her crying quietly. "You did it, baby. You did what I couldn't." The words hit like a weight I didn't know I was still carrying. I'd told myself the fight with David was about principle, about justice, about fairness. But really, it was about my mother, about watching her shrink under a man's shadow and promising myself I'd never let that happen again. Every time David cornered me, every time he made another woman feel small, I saw my father's smirk all over again. I'd been fighting him without realizing it. And now, hearing her voice, that connection snapped into focus like lightning across a dark sky. We talked for hours. She told me she'd left town, remarried quietly, found peace in a small house by the coast. She said she'd watched my story unfold and cried because, for the first time, someone had broken the cycle. "You were brave for both of us," she said. "I don't know if you realize that." I didn't know what to say. My throat tightened. Words stuck somewhere between pride and grief. "I just didn't want him to win," I whispered. "None of them." After that call, I sat on my balcony for a long time, watching the sun slide down over Dallas. The city glowed gold and pink, the kind of light that makes even broken things look beautiful. I realized that sometimes justice isn't loud or public. Sometimes it's generational. something you do not just for yourself, but for every version of you that was told to sit still and be quiet. A week later, I took a drive back to that small town I swore I'd never see again. The streets hadn't changed much. The diner on Main Street still had the same neon sign. The church still sat crooked on the corner. I parked outside my childhood home and just sat there. The house was different now, painted blue, new owners. But the ghosts were the same. I thought about the girl who'd lived in that bedroom window, counting the hours until she could leave. And for the first time, I wanted to tell her something. You made it out. You did what you promised. That night, I called my mom again. You know, she said, people think courage is about shouting, but sometimes it's about surviving long enough to tell the story. I smiled through tears. I think that's what I've been doing, I said, telling the story. It hit me then. How much of my life had been shaped by the silence of women. My mother, Melissa, Brittany, even me before I broke it. All of us had carried versions of the same weight, being told to endure, to adapt, to forgive what we shouldn't have to. But maybe the point wasn't just surviving it. Maybe it was naming it, dragging it out into the light so the next woman wouldn't have to. A few days later, an email landed in my inbox. Subject line, "Thank you." It was from Melissa. I hesitated before opening it, but my hands were steady. Her words were simple, but heavy with meaning. She said she'd been angry, devastated, humiliated, but also grateful. She said she'd watched her kids sleeping one night and realized that the truth, however painful, had freed her too. "You reminded me who I used to be," she wrote, "and maybe one day I'll thank you in person. But for now, just know I see you. I understand." I read that line over and over until the words blurred. It wasn't forgiveness, not exactly, but it was understanding, and maybe that was enough. That weekend, I drove down to the coast to visit my mom. Her hair was shorter now, streaked with gray, her laugh softer but still familiar. We sat on her porch watching the waves crash, and for the first time in years, the silence between us didn't hurt. It healed. She turned to me and said, "You've always had that fire, Madison. I used to worry it would burn you. Now I see it's what saved you." I smiled and looked out at the horizon, the sea stretching endless and bright. "Maybe," I said, "or maybe I just learned how to aim it." In that moment, I understood something I hadn't before. Justice wasn't the end of my story. It was the beginning. What came next wasn't about revenge or retribution. It was about using that fire to light the way for others, to make sure the next girl who walked into a room like that never had to stand there alone. By early spring, the story had settled into background noise, replaced by newer scandals and fresher headlines. The cameras vanished, the news cycle spun on, and the world moved forward like it always does. But for me, and for the women who'd lived through it, moving forward didn't mean forgetting. It meant building something new out of the pieces we had left. I quit the company a few weeks after David's sentencing. They'd offered me a corner office and a raise, but the walls still smelled like him. I needed clean air. So I packed a box, left my ID badge on the desk, and walked out without a backward glance. I started consulting instead. Freelance work for small businesses that actually cared about ethics. No hierarchy, no glass offices, no hidden games, just people trying to do things right. The first time I walked into a meeting as my own boss, I felt that same jolt of freedom I'd felt the night the truth came out. It wasn't power, not in the way he'd wielded it. It was peace. Brittany thrived. She finished her degree, transferred to a nonprofit that helps women start careers after workplace trauma, and became their youngest project lead. Every time we talked, she sounded lighter. One night over tacos, she told me she'd started therapy too. "I used to think I was weak," she said, looking at her drink. "But now I think surviving made me strong. You showed me that." I smiled. "You showed yourself that," I told her. Melissa and I finally met again, months later. She asked me to lunch, said she was ready. We picked a quiet cafe on the edge of Austin, the kind of place where nobody cared who you were. When she walked in, she looked different. Older, sure, but free in a way I'd never seen before. We hugged awkwardly, then sat down. For a few minutes, neither of us said anything. Finally, she spoke. "I hated you at first," she admitted, eyes steady. "I hated that you knew before I did. That you held the truth in your hands while I was still playing Wife of the Year. I nodded, throat tight. I understand. She took a deep breath. But then I realized it wasn't you who betrayed me. It was him. You just refused to keep his secret. We talked for hours. About the kids, her new house by the lake, her plans to go back to school. Before we left, she reached across the table and took my hand. "Thank you," she said. "Not just for telling me, for reminding me I could start over." The words hit me like sunlight after a storm. When we said goodbye, I knew it wasn't the end of something. It was the start of forgiveness. Not the kind that excuses, but the kind that releases. Meanwhile, the company underwent what the press called a cultural transformation. There were new trainings, new protocols, new leadership, but under all that PR gloss, something real had shifted. Women started speaking up, quietly at first, then louder. HR's inbox overflowed with reports that would have been buried a year before. The CEO sent out an internal memo acknowledging systemic failure. They even brought in an external review board led by women. Maybe it was all cosmetic, or maybe it was the first step toward something better. Either way, I'd started a fire they couldn't put out. I began volunteering with a local advocacy group that supported workplace survivors. At first, I just answered emails and helped with admin work, but eventually I started mentoring younger women. Interns, assistants, anyone who'd been through the same patterns. The first time I sat across from a trembling 22-year-old telling me her story, I recognized that same look of shame I used to see in my mirror. "You did nothing wrong," I told her. "You have every right to be angry. Just promise me you'll use it wisely." She nodded through tears, and I saw a little spark of strength return to her eyes. That's when I knew this was what I was meant to do. My therapist, Celeste, once told me that justice and redemption aren't the same thing. "Justice fixes the record," she said. "Redemption fixes the heart." For a long time, I didn't believe her. But then life started to feel normal again. Not perfect, just peaceful. I could go a whole day without thinking about him. I could hear laughter in an office without flinching. I could look in the mirror and see someone who'd survived without losing her softness. That, I realized, was redemption. One evening, I got a message from Danny. He moved. Out of state. No new job yet. I read it twice, and then deleted it. I didn't need to know where he was anymore. His story wasn't mine to carry. My mother, meanwhile, had come to visit for a weekend. We walked around White Rock Lake, talking about everything and nothing. At one point, she stopped, squeezed my hand, and said, "You know, baby, maybe this was the only way your story could go. You took what hurt you and turned it into a torch." I smiled. I think I finally know how to hold it without burning. That night, we cooked dinner together, music playing low, the kind of simple comfort I hadn't known since childhood. I realized I wasn't defined by what had happened anymore. The story wasn't about a man's fall. It was about the women who refused to stay down with him. Before bed, I scrolled through my old emails and found the one Melissa had sent months before. I reread her line, "You reminded me who I used to be." I thought about all of us. My mother, Melissa, Brittany, the girls from the advocacy group, and me. We were a chain of survivors, linked by something painful but also by something powerful. Truth. And that truth had stopped being a weapon and become a bridge. So I wrote one final email, this time to myself. The subject line, redemption. The body. You did what you had to do. You told the truth. And that will always be enough. I hit send, knowing it would land in my inbox, quiet and unseen, like a message in a bottle waiting for some future version of me to find it again when the world got heavy. Then I turned off the lights, crawled into bed, and whispered into the dark. We made it. Summer arrived in slow, golden waves, the kind that make Dallas shimmer like a mirage. I'd moved into a smaller apartment by then, nothing fancy, just a third-floor walk-up with creaky floors, plants by the window, and quiet neighbors who kept to themselves. Some nights I'd sit on the balcony with a glass of sweet tea, watch the sunset melt into the skyline, and finally feel the peace that used to seem impossible. The noise had faded. The interviews had stopped. Even the online chatter, both hateful and praising, had moved on. What was left was silence, the good kind, the kind that comes after the storm has passed, when the air smells clean again. I was still consulting, still volunteering, still figuring out what came next. But everything felt lighter now. The anger had burned itself out, leaving only clarity in its ashes. I'd stopped replaying the moments in my head, the meetings, the threats, the courtroom. I no longer needed to. The story had already been written, lived, and closed. What remained was mine. One afternoon, I drove out to Austin to visit Melissa and the kids. It had been nearly a year since the scandal, but when I pulled into her driveway, it felt like no time had passed. Her son was playing basketball in the driveway. Her daughter ran barefoot through sprinklers, laughing in a way that sounded like healing. Melissa waved from the porch, a glass of lemonade in hand. She looked free. That's the only word that fit. Free of the tension that used to live in her shoulders, free of the exhaustion that used to shadow her eyes. We sat outside and talked for hours, about everything and nothing. New schools, small joys, the weirdness of starting over. At one point, she looked at me and said, "You know, sometimes I still wake up expecting to find his side of the bed warm, and then I remember that the cold means I'm safe." I nodded. "Cold can be comforting," I said softly. She smiled. "It can." Before I left, she handed me an envelope. Inside was a photograph from that night at the charity dinner, the one before everything fell apart. We were both in the background, blurry, caught mid-laugh. "Proof we were in the same room before the truth," she said. I tucked it into my wallet, not as a reminder of pain, but of how far we'd come. Brittany called me later that night. She'd just gotten promoted. Her voice was steady, confident in a way that made me proud. "Guess who's running her own team now?" she said, laughing. "Guess who told her boss she won't take meetings alone after hours?" I laughed too. "You?" "Me," she said. "You taught me that." I hung up feeling a warmth that no amount of chaos could ever touch. Even my mom started visiting more often. She'd come up for a weekend and we'd cook, talk, sit on the porch with wine and silence. The quiet between us was easy now, healed. One night she asked, "Do you ever wish it hadn't happened?" I thought about it for a long moment. "Sometimes," I admitted. "But if it hadn't, I'd still be that woman who stayed quiet, the one who mistook survival for living." She nodded slowly. Then maybe it needed to happen. There were still moments when memories crept in, the smell of his cologne, the tone of his voice, the way people used to look away when he walked by. But now those memories felt distant, like old photographs fading at the edges. They didn't sting anymore. They just reminded me of how far I'd climbed to reach this peace. A few months later, the advocacy group I volunteered with asked if I'd speak at one of their events. At first I said no. I didn't want to be the story again, but they insisted it wasn't about publicity. It was about connection. So I agreed. The night of the event, I stood on a small stage in a community center gym, the kind with folding chairs and bad acoustics. The audience was a mix of survivors, students, and a few men who'd come to learn. When I stepped up to the microphone, the nerves hit me hard. My hands shook, my throat tightened, but then I looked out at all those faces, some scared, some strong, and the words came. "I used to think justice was something handed down from people in power," I began. "Now I know it starts when someone decides to stop lying to themselves, when someone says, 'No more.' That's where it begins. With truth." The room went silent, except for the quiet hum of the lights overhead. "The truth cost me a lot," I continued, "but silence would have cost me everything." When I finished, people stood and clapped. Not the loud, performative kind. Soft, steady applause that felt like understanding. Afterward, women came up to me with tears in their eyes, thanking me, telling me their own stories. A few men did too, saying they wanted to listen better, to lead differently. It wasn't fame. It wasn't glory. It was purpose. Later, as I was leaving, a young girl about 19 stopped me. "How did you know when it was time to speak up?" she asked. I smiled. When I realized the fear of staying silent finally felt heavier than the fear of telling the truth. She nodded slowly, like she was tucking the words away for later. I hoped she'd never have to use them, but if she did, I hoped they'd keep her brave. Driving home that night, the city lights blurred in the distance, just like they had the night everything started. Only this time, I wasn't afraid of what waited ahead. I wasn't running from anything. I was moving toward something, toward peace, toward purpose, toward the quiet kind of power that no one could ever take from me again. When I got home, I stood on the balcony one last time, the air warm, crickets humming. I thought about everyone this story had touched. Melissa, Brittany, my mother, Danny, Celeste, and me. We'd all lost something, but we'd gained something too. A sense of knowing ourselves, of refusing to shrink, of standing tall, even when it shook our legs to do it. I took a deep breath, looked out at the glowing horizon, and whispered, half to myself, half to the universe, "It's over." But I knew it wasn't really an ending. It was just the beginning of a life built on truth.